The words reached the kitchen before the footsteps did. They arrived through the open service door on a draft of cold morning air, spoken in a voice that carried the crystalline authority of a woman who had never once been contradicted in her own home. The cook should stay in the kitchen. I will not have her wandering the house as though she owns it. Nell heard them clearly. Every syllable, every pause, every shade of disdain. She was standing at the long oak work table, her hands buried in a mound of pastry dough, her apron already streaked with butter and flour. Around her the kitchen staff went still. The clatter of copper, the hiss of the stockpot, the rhythmic chopping of the scullery boy, all of it ceased as though the room itself had drawn a sharp breath. The Dowager Duchess of Ashvale had arrived at Briarstone Hall that morning. Her carriage had been seen from the kitchen windows shortly after dawn, black and gleaming as a beetle, lurching up the long gravel drive through the autumn mist. By the time her trunks were unloaded and her rooms aired, the entire household knew two things. She was here for the month, and she was displeased. The reason for her displeasure had a name. Or rather, it had two names. The first was Marin, 7 years old, the Duke's only child, a girl who had not spoken a single word in 11 months. The second was Nell. No one could say exactly when it had started. Perhaps 3 weeks ago, perhaps a month. The child had simply appeared in the kitchen one afternoon, a small, pale figure in a white pinafore, standing in the doorway like a ghost, unsure of its welcome. She had stood there for nearly an hour watching Nell work, watching her hands move through dough, lift lids, pinch salt between her fingers. The head steward, Mr. Garrick Price, had tried to send the child away. Marin had looked at him with those vast gray eyes and had not moved. She simply waited until he gave up, and then she sat on the stone step by the garden door and watched Nell until the supper was served. The next day she came again. And the day after that, on the 4th day, she ate. It was a small thing, barely a mouthful, a corner of warm bread that Nell had baked with rosemary from the kitchen garden, a sprig she had chosen because its scent reminded her of something from a long time ago, a different kitchen, a different life. Nell had placed the bread on a saucer and set it on the step beside the child without comment. Marin had picked it up, sniffed it, and taken a bite. Then another. It was the first food she had eaten willingly in 5 weeks. The household should have celebrated. Instead, it panicked. Marin had been assigned to the care of her governess, Miss Dundry, a capable but humorless woman who had been hired specifically to manage the child's silence and her refusal of food. Miss Dundry had tried everything: broths, jellies, custards, the bland, approved diet of a sickly child. All of it had been pushed away or left untouched. And now a kitchen cook, a junior one at that, barely 6 months in the position, had succeeded where the governess had failed. It was an embarrassment. It was also, in the rigid hierarchy of the household, an offense. Word had reached the Duke. Word had reached his mother. And now the Dowager's verdict hung in the kitchen air like smoke. The cook should stay in the kitchen. Nell did not look up from her pastry. She worked the dough with steady hands, pressing and folding, pressing and folding. Her face as calm as the surface of a well. Around her, the kitchen staff exchanged glances. She felt their eyes. She always felt their eyes. There was a particular quality to the attention of people who were relieved that someone else had been singled out. A mixture of sympathy and satisfaction, warm on the surface, sharp underneath. Mr. Reety. Price appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the arch. His face wore the expression. It always wore a thin smile of professional composure that concealed something harder beneath. "You heard her Grace," he said, addressing the room but looking at Nell. "The child is not to be encouraged. She belongs upstairs. This is a kitchen, not a nursery." Nell inclined her head. "Yes, Mr. Price." She said nothing more. She did not need to. The words were clear and the message even clearer. The quiet cook, who had somehow reached the Duke's silent daughter, was being put back in her place. And everyone was watching to see if she would stay there. She stayed there, or rather, she tried. For 3 days after the dowager's declaration, Nell kept to the kitchen. She did not venture into the corridors beyond the service wing. She did not linger in the herb garden when Marin's window overlooked it. She cooked, she cleaned, she followed Mr. Price's schedules to the letter. She was the model of obedience, invisible and industrious. But Marin came to her. The child did not obey boundaries. She moved through the house like water, finding the lowest point, slipping past her governess, through the baize door that separated the family's world from the servants, and down the narrow stone steps to the kitchen. She did it silently, without fuss, without expression. She simply arrived. The first time, after the dowager's declaration, Nell saw the small figure in the doorway and felt her stomach clench. She could not afford this. She turned her back and continued stirring the soup. She heard the soft pad of the child's shoes on the flagstones. She felt the warmth of a small body settle onto the step by the garden door, the usual spot. Nell did not acknowledge her. She stirred, she seasoned, she lifted the heavy stockpot from the range. She moved through her duties as though the child were not there. But something passed between them in the silence, a current of understanding that had nothing to do with words. Marin watched her with those enormous gray eyes, her knees drawn up, her thin arms wrapped around her shins. She watched the way Nell moved, the sureness of her hands, the way she lifted herbs to her nose before chopping them, the private, thoughtful ritual of a woman who understood plants the way a musician understands notes. After an hour, Nell placed a small bowl of broth on the step. She did not look at the child. She did not speak. She simply set it down and moved away. When she returned 20 minutes later, the bowl was empty. That evening, Miss Dundry reported that Marin had refused her supper again. Every morsel placed before her upstairs went untouched. But in the kitchen, she had eaten. The pattern deepened over the days that followed. Marin appeared each afternoon, always at the same hour, always silent. She ate what Nell offered, and nothing else. A sliver of poached pear with thyme, a cup of warm milk infused with lavender and honey. Tiny portions, made with a care and specificity that baffled the other kitchen staff. Nell chose each ingredient with a precision that suggested she was not merely cooking, but prescribing, selecting flavors and herbs with an understanding that went far beyond the instinct of a talented cook. The child began to change. The hollows beneath her eyes softened, a faint color returned to her cheeks. She did not speak, but she no longer looked as though she were disappearing. She was present, alert, anchored to the world by the quiet figure at the work table and the small deliberate meals she produced. Then it went further. One afternoon, Nell stepped out to the walled kitchen garden to cut parsley. The October sun was pale and thin, the air sharp with the scent of turned earth. She knelt among the herbs, her shears working in quick, decisive clips. A shadow fell across the bed. Marin was standing behind her. She had followed her outside. Nell's heart sank. Out here, they were visible. The kitchen garden was overlooked by the windows of the morning room, the dowager's favorite retreat. She could not send the child away. She had no authority to give orders to the Duke's daughter. She could only continue her work and hope the moment would pass. But Marin did not simply stand and watch this time. She knelt. She knelt right beside Nell in the cold, dark soil, her white pinafore pressing into the earth. She reached out and touched the parsley with her fingertips, then looked up at Nell with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a smile, but something in between, something that had been locked away for a very long time. Nell felt her eyes sting. She turned her face away and blinked hard. She pointed to a different plant, a low bush of silvery green beside the parsley. "Sage," she said softly. It was the first word she had spoken directly to the child. Marin touched the sage leaf. She rubbed it between her small fingers, then lifted them to her nose. Her eyebrows rose. Something flickered in her face, a spark of life, of interest, of connection to the physical world that grief had sealed away. From the morning room window, the Dowager Duchess watched. Her mouth was a thin, bloodless line. Beside her, the governess wrung her hands. But in a different window, one floor above, the Duke stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. He had been watching for some time. He had seen the child kneel in the dirt. He had seen the cook point to the sage. He had seen the change in his daughter's face. It was the first sign of life he had witnessed in Marin since the day they buried her mother in the chapel yard 11 months ago. The cook had not sought this. She had not performed for an audience. She had simply knelt in a garden and named a plant, and his daughter had responded as though she had been spoken to in a language she had been waiting to hear. He stood at the window for a long time after both figures had gone back inside. The October light faded. The garden grew cold. He did not move. Something had shifted in him, a question forming in the place where certainty used to live. Who was this woman, and why did his daughter, who had closed herself to every comfort the world had offered, open like a flower in her presence? He did not have an answer, but for the first time in nearly a year, Lord Emeric Davenhart, the 9th Duke of Ashvale, wanted one. Her name was not Nell. It had never been Nell. Her name was Saren Thorne, and she had come to Briarstone Hall not for a cook's wages, but for proof. Proof that her life had been stolen, and that the man who had stolen it had a brother who managed the Duke's household each evening and slept in a warm room above the courtyard, while she scrubbed turnips in the cellar below. Her father, Dr. Caedmon Thorne, had been one of the most respected botanical scholars in the south of England. Not a wealthy man by the standards of the great landowners, but a comfortable one. He had owned a handsome stone house on the edge of Dartmoor called Briar Cottage, with 3 acres of cultivated gardens that were famous among naturalists from London to Edinburgh. He had published 2 volumes on the medicinal properties of native English plants. He had lectured at the Royal Institution, and he had loved his daughter with a quiet, fierce devotion that had shaped every corner of her childhood. Saren had grown up in his glasshouse and his study, surrounded by pressed flowers and leather-bound journals and the smell of damp earth. She had learned her Latin from the labels on seed drawers before she could properly read English. She had learned to cook from necessity after her mother died when she was 12, but her father's knowledge had transformed that necessity into something deeper. She understood ingredients the way he understood specimens. She knew what lavender did to a restless mind, what rosemary did to sluggish blood, what the correct preparation of valerian could do for a child who could not sleep. Her cooking was not merely craft. It was science dressed in an apron, and it was the last gift her father had given her without knowing it. Dr. Thorne had died 3 years ago, taken by a fever that swept through the village in the winter of 1841. He had been 57. She had been 19, alone, and according to his will the sole inheritor of Briar Cottage, his library, his published works, and a modest but sustaining annual income from a trust he had established with his solicitor. She had never received a penny of it. Within a month of her father's burial, a man had appeared. Aldous Price, a distant relation of her mother's, a man Saren had met only twice in her entire life. He was smooth, well-dressed, and carried with him a second will. This document, he claimed, superseded the original. It left everything to him: the cottage, the library, the gardens, the trust. It bore her father's signature, though Saren knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest like a live coal, that her father had never written it. The witnesses were strangers. The solicitor who had drafted her father's true will had died suddenly 2 months before Caedmon himself, replaced by a man who was, Saren would later discover, Aldous Price's own associate. The theft was surgical and complete. Within 6 weeks, she had been turned out of her home with nothing but a small trunk of personal belongings and £14. Aldous Price sold the library for a sum she could not bear to calculate. He sold the cottage. He let the gardens go to ruin. 3 years of her father's final work, a comprehensive manuscript on the medicinal flora of the West Country, vanished entirely. Saren had spent the next 2 years in a kind of living burial. She had worked as a scullery maid in Exeter, a laundress in Bath, a kitchen girl in a coaching inn on the Bristol Road. She had written letters to every solicitor and magistrate she could find, and every one of them had turned her away. A young woman with no connections, no funds, and no proof had no standing in the courts. She was invisible, and Aldous Price knew it. Then a letter had found her. It came from a Dr. Josias Pemberton, an old colleague of her father's, who had been traveling abroad and had only recently learned of Caedmon's death and his daughter's disappearance. Pemberton remembered something crucial. In the last years of his life, Caedmon Thorne had been conducting research at Briarstone Hall, cataloguing the estate's extensive botanical collection at the invitation of the old Duke, Lord Emeric's father. The two men had been close friends, united by a shared passion for rare plants and natural philosophy. Pemberton believed that Caedmon, ever cautious with his most important papers, might have left copies of his manuscript, his original will and the deed to Briar Cottage at Briarstone for safekeeping. And there was something else. Something that had made Saren's blood run cold when she first read it. Aldous Price's younger brother, a man named Garrick Price, had for the past 15 years been the head steward of Briarstone Hall. The man who had orchestrated the theft of her entire life had a brother inside the very house where the proof of that theft might still exist. Whether Garrick knew what his brother had done, whether he had been complicit, whether he was even now ensuring those papers never surfaced, Saren could not say. But the coincidence was too sharp, too precise to be innocent. So Saren Thorne had disappeared. And Nell, a quiet, capable cook with forged references and a story of being raised by an aunt in Cornwall, had applied for a position in the kitchens of Briarstone Hall. She had been hired 6 months ago, one of 3 junior cooks under the watchful authority of Mr. Garrick Price himself. She had spent those months learning the house, its corridors, its rhythms, the habits of its master and its staff. She knew which doors were locked at night and which were left open. She knew that the old Duke's study, now used as a secondary sitting room, had been cleared of papers years ago, the contents boxed and stored somewhere she had not yet been able to locate. She knew that Mr. Gone Price kept a ring of keys on his belt that included one to a storeroom beneath the east wing that no one else was permitted to enter. And she knew that time was not on her side. Each week that passed was another week in which those papers might be destroyed, moved, or simply rot away in a forgotten corner of this vast cold house. She had not planned on Marin. The child's arrival in the kitchen had been an ambush of the heart, an unlooked-for connection that had thrown her careful invisibility into disarray. Every meal she prepared for the girl, every herb she selected with the knowledge her father had given her, was a risk. It drew attention. It made her visible. It turned her from a shadow into a story. And now the Dowager had noticed. Mr. Price had noticed. The Duke himself had noticed. She was no longer invisible, and invisibility was the only armor she had. She stood at the kitchen work table that evening, long after the others had gone to bed, scraping the last of the day's flour from the oak surface with a flat blade. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the dull glow of the banked fire. She worked in silence, her thoughts turning in the same tight circle they had worn for months: the storeroom, the keys, the papers. And now, threading through it all like a vine she could not pull free, the image of a small girl kneeling in the dirt, lifting sage to her nose and looking up with eyes that asked for nothing except to be near her. Saren pressed the heels of her hands into the table and closed her eyes. She could not afford to love that child. She could not afford to be seen. But the heart, she was learning, did not take orders from the head, no matter how desperate the circumstances. She opened her eyes, wiped down the table, hung her apron on the hook by the door, and climbed the narrow back stairs to her small room beneath the eaves. Tomorrow, she would try again. Tomorrow she would find a way into that storeroom, or she would find another path to the truth her father had hidden somewhere in this house. She had not come this far to fail. Not for her father, not for herself, and not, she realized with a pang that frightened her more than any lock or key, for the silent little girl who had chosen her out of all the noise and coldness of the world, and asked her, without a single word, to stay. The order came the following morning, delivered not by Mr. Price but by his deputy, a thin, nervous woman named Mrs. Calloway, who could not meet Nell's eyes as she spoke. His Grace's mother has requested that the kitchen be closed to all members of the household except kitchen staff during working hours. No exceptions. The child is to be redirected to her governess immediately if she appears. And you are not to prepare any food for Lady Marin outside of the approved menu. Miss Dundry will provide the meal plan. Is that understood? Nell wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. It is understood, Mrs. Calloway. The woman hesitated, as though she wanted to say something more, something human, but the rigidity of the house swallowed it. She turned and left. Nell stood at her work table and felt the walls of the kitchen, which had become the closest thing she had to a sanctuary, close in around her. The order was precise and airtight. It did not merely forbid her from seeking the child. It forbade the child from reaching her. The kitchen door would be watched. The meals would be dictated. The thread that had formed between her and Marin, fragile and wordless and vital, was being cut with administrative shears. She obeyed. She had no choice. Her position, her mission, her entire reason for being in this house depended on compliance. She locked the kitchen door during working hours for the first time in her 6 months at Briarstone. She prepared the approved menu without alteration. Bland porridge, boiled fish, milk pudding. The food of a sickroom, chosen for nutrition and utterly devoid of the warmth and care that had coaxed Marin back to life. That afternoon she heard footsteps outside the locked kitchen door. Small footsteps. They stopped. There was a pause, and then a sound that went through Nell like a blade. A soft knock, not loud, not insistent, just a child's hand against wood, asking a question that had no words. Nell gripped the edge of the work table. Her knuckles went white. The scullery boy, Tobias, looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. His young face was stricken. "Should I let her in?" he whispered. "No." The word came out steady. She did not know how. "She is to go to Miss Dundry." Tobias went to the door and opened it a crack. Nell heard his voice, gentle and awkward, telling the child she could not come in today. There was no response. There was never a response from Marin. No protest, no tears, no tantrum. Just silence, and then the soft retreating sound of small shoes on stone. Nell turned to the range. She lifted a pot lid and stirred something she could not see because her vision had blurred. She blinked hard, set her jaw, and stirred until her hand was steady. That evening, Miss Dundry reported that Marin had not eaten. Not a mouthful. The approved menu had been placed before her and ignored entirely. The child had sat at the nursery table for 40 minutes, her hands in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on nothing, and then she had been put to bed without supper. The report reached the Duke at his desk. It also reached the Dowager in her morning room. The Dowager said nothing. Miss Dundry said everything in the careful language of a woman covering her position. The Duke listened, dismissed the governess, and sat alone in the failing light. From his study window he could see the walled kitchen garden below. At this hour, it was empty. The herbs standing in neat dark rows, the sagebush undisturbed. He thought of his daughter kneeling there, her fingers on the leaves, the expression on her face. He thought of the cook's hand pointing, her voice saying a single word. He thought of the silence that had followed Marin's knock on the kitchen door. He had not heard it himself, but the footman had told the deputy, and the deputy had told Mrs. Calloway, and Mrs. Calloway had mentioned it to Mr. Redder, Price within earshot of the Duke's valet. And so the story had completed its inevitable circuit through the house until it reached him as all stories did, late and distorted, but carrying at its center an image he could not dismiss. His daughter, standing outside a locked door, knocking once, and then walking away. The cook had not opened the door. She had followed the rule. She had done exactly what had been demanded of her, and somehow that made it worse. He rose from his desk and walked to the fireplace. The portrait above the mantel showed his late wife, Isabel. Dark hair, pale skin, a smile that had always seemed to be keeping a gentle secret. She had died in the early spring of the previous year. Not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, taken by a fever that should not have been fatal but was. She had been ill for a week. She had been gone before anyone understood the danger. Maren had stopped speaking the day of the funeral. She had stood beside the grave in her black dress, her hand in his, and she had simply closed, like a book shutting, like a door. Every doctor, every governess, every well-meaning relative had tried to reach her since. The child endured their efforts with a patience that was more disturbing than any tantrum, and she remained silent, until a cook had placed a piece of rosemary bread on a stone step and walked away. Emeric stared at his wife's portrait and asked himself a question he had been avoiding. Was his mother wrong? He had deferred to her in all matters concerning the household and Maren's care. She was experienced. She was formidable. She was his mother. But she was also a woman who believed that order was the answer to grief, that structure and discipline could hold a broken household together the way mortar held stones. She had never understood what he was only now beginning to see, that Maren's silence was not disobedience. It was not a problem to be managed with approved menus and hired governesses. It was a wound so deep the child had no language for it. And the cook, this quiet, unremarkable woman in a flour-dusted apron, had reached that wound without words, without strategy, without authority. She had done it with sage and warm bread and the simple willingness to let a grieving child sit beside her without demands. His mother had shut that down. He had allowed it. He thought of Mr. Chal, Price's assured reports, his dry assessments of the cook's behavior. She oversteps, Your Grace. She encourages the child's attachment for her own purposes. The kitchen is no place for a child of this house. The steward's analysis had seemed reasonable at the time, spoken in the measured tones of a man who had managed Briarstone for over a decade and had never given cause for doubt. But now Emeric heard something else beneath those measured tones. Not concern for Maren. Not even concern for order. Something more personal, a tightness, a territorial edge, as though the cook's quiet influence was not merely an inconvenience but a threat. He walked to the window again and stood in the darkness, looking out at nothing. His mother's words echoed. The cook should stay in the kitchen. The words of a woman who had never cooked a meal in her life, who had never knelt in the dirt beside a silent child, who had never placed food before a grieving creature with no expectation of gratitude or reward. He made no decisions that night. He was not a man who acted on impulse, but he lay awake until the small hours, and the image that kept him from sleep was not his mother's stern face or the steward's composed reports. It was a locked kitchen door, a child's single knock, and the retreating sound of small shoes on stone. Something was wrong in his house. He could feel it now, the way one feels a change in the weather before the clouds appear. He did not yet know what it was, but the certainty that he had been looking in the wrong direction settled into him like cold water, and it did not leave. The storeroom key was the third from the left on Mr. Price's ring. Nell had counted them 100 times, watching the steward from across the kitchen, from the end of a corridor, from the shadow of the buttery, where she sometimes stood inventorying the preserves. There were 9 keys in total, each one a different size and color of brass. The third was smaller than the others, darker, its bow shaped in an unusual trefoil pattern that she had memorized from 20 feet away. That key opened the door beneath the east wing, the room where the old Duke's papers had been stored after his death, and where, if Dr. Pemberton's guess was correct, her father's documents still lay hidden. She had to get into that room. And after 12 days of the new regime, 12 days of locked kitchen doors and a child who was growing thinner and more ghost-like by the hour, she knew she could wait no longer. The opportunity came on a Thursday. Mr. Price left Briarstone each Thursday evening to attend a card game in the village, a ritual he had maintained for years. He departed at 7 and did not return until after 11. On those evenings the house ran on its own momentum. The footmen relaxed. The maids lingered over their supper. The deputy housekeeper retired early. It was the one night each week when the machinery of surveillance slowed, and the gaps between its gears widened just enough for a shadow to slip through. Nell waited until 9:30. The kitchen was dark, the fires banked, the scullery boy long gone to bed. She removed her apron, changed into her darkest dress, and took the servants' staircase down to the cellar level. The stone corridors were black and cold, lit only by a single tallow candle she carried cupped in her hand. Her heartbeat was a drum in her ears. Each step felt like a declaration, loud and reckless and final. The east wing cellar was at the end of a passage that ran beneath the main hall. She had walked it only once before, during her first week when she had been shown the wine stores and the root cellars. The storeroom was beyond those, past a turn in the passage where the walls grew damp and the air tasted of old stone. She reached the door. It was heavy oak, banded with iron, and it was locked. She had expected this. She had also prepared for it. 3 days ago, she had found a ring of old keys in a drawer of the stillroom, forgotten and green with tarnish. She had cleaned them one by one in the quiet hours after supper, and she had brought all 6 tonight, hoping that one might fit a lock that was decades old and perhaps not as unique as Mr. Price believed. She set the candle on the floor and tried the first key. It did not fit. The second was too large. The third slid into the keyhole but would not turn. Her fingers were trembling. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and fast, amplified by the stone walls. The fourth key would not enter at all. The fifth turned. The lock gave with a sound that seemed enormous in the silence. A grinding metallic protest that echoed down the corridor like a shout. Nell froze. She pressed herself against the door and listened, her blood roaring in her ears. 10 seconds. 20, no. Footsteps. No. Voices. The house above her was silent. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was smaller than she had imagined. It smelled of dust and mildew and something faintly sweet, the ghost of old paper. Her candle threw a weak circle of light across wooden crates stacked along the walls, old furniture draped in cloths, and on the far side, a row of shelves holding leather portfolios and document boxes. She crossed the room, her feet leaving prints in the thick dust. No one had been in here for a long time. She began with the shelves. She pulled down the first portfolio and opened it. Estate accounts from 1832. Useless. The second held correspondence between the old Duke and his land agent. The third was a bundle of architectural drawings for a wing of the house that had never been built. Her hands moved faster, her care giving way to urgency. She had no idea how much time she had. If Price returned early, if a footman made rounds, if anyone noticed her absence from her room. The fourth portfolio was heavier than the others. She opened it and felt her heart lurch. The handwriting on the first page was her father's. She would have known it anywhere. The small, precise letters, the particular way he formed his capital letters, with an upward flourish that he had once told her was a habit from his university days. It was a sheaf of notes on the botanical collection at Briarstone, written during his visits to the old Duke. She flipped through the pages with shaking hands. Descriptions of specimens, annotations in Latin, cross-references to his published work. It was his research, his mind laid out on paper. But it was not what she needed. There was no will here, no deed, no legal document. She set the portfolio aside and reached for the next one on the shelf. A floorboard creaked above her. Nell's candle flame shivered. She cupped her hand around it and went absolutely still. The creak had come from directly overhead, from the corridor above the east wing cellar. It could be anything: the house settling, a draft shifting a door, a cat. It came again, and then a third time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured. Someone was walking above her, and they were walking towards the cellar stairs. She looked at the open portfolio in her hands, at the shelves she had not yet searched, at the door she had left ajar behind her. She had seconds, not minutes. She could not be found here. Discovery meant dismissal, accusation, the end of everything. Aldous Price's stolen papers would vanish forever, and she would be thrown out with nothing, again for the second time in her life. She closed the portfolio and shoved it back onto the shelf. She grabbed her candle and moved to the door. She eased it. Shut behind her, fumbled the key back into the lock, turned it. The grinding sound was impossibly loud. She pulled the key free and pressed it into her palm, the metal biting into her skin. The footsteps were on the cellar stairs now. She could hear them clearly. The soft scuff of leather soles on stone, descending with a patience that was worse than haste. Whoever it was, they were not rushing. They were not alarmed. They were simply coming, steady and inevitable. She blew out her candle. The darkness was total. She pressed herself against the wall of the passage, her back flat against the cold, damp stone, and tried to make herself nothing. No breath, no movement, no presence at all. A light appeared at the far end of the corridor. Not a candle. A lamp, steady and bright, held at shoulder height. It illuminated the passage in a wash of warm gold, and in that gold, casting a long shadow on the stone floor, walked a figure she recognized instantly. Not Mr. Price, not a footman, not a maid on an errand, the Duke. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He did not speak immediately. He stood at the end of the corridor. The lamp held steady, its light reaching her before his voice did. She could see his face now, half illuminated, half in shadow. He was not wearing his formal coat. He was in shirt sleeves, his collar loosened, his dark hair slightly disordered, as though he had risen from his desk on an impulse and followed it without pausing to dress for the occasion. His expression was not anger. It was something more controlled and more dangerous. It was the look of a man assembling facts. "You are a long way from the kitchen," he said. His voice was quiet. It carried no heat. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being answered, and answered truthfully. Nell pressed her back against the wall and said nothing. Her mind was racing, turning over options like cards in a losing hand. She could lie. She could claim she had been looking for something from the root cellar. A jar of preserves, a sack of flour stored in the wrong place. But the root cellar was 3 doors behind her, and the key in her palm was not to any room a cook had business entering. "I heard a sound," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "I came down to check. From your room on the 4th floor," he said. In the dark, with no lamp, the impossibility of her excuse hung in the air between them. She felt the heat rise in her face and was grateful for the darkness that hid it. He walked towards her. His footsteps were unhurried, the lamp swinging slightly with each stride, sending shadows leaping across the walls. He stopped 6 feet from her. The light fell fully on her now, and she knew he could see everything. The dark dress she had changed into, the dust on her hem, the guilty stillness of her posture. "What is in your hand?" he asked. She opened her fingers. The old key lay on her palm, its trefoil bow glinting in the lamplight. He looked at it. He looked at the door behind her. He looked at the dust on the floor, the single trail of footprints leading from the door to where she stood. "That is the storeroom," he said. "It holds my father's papers. You have been inside." It was not a question. She did not insult him by denying it. "Yes, Your Grace." Why, the word was simple and enormous. It filled the corridor. It demanded an answer that she could not give without destroying everything she had built, and could not refuse without confirming every suspicion that would lead to her ruin. She chose a middle path, narrow as a knife edge. "I was looking for something that belongs to me," she said. His eyebrows rose. It was the first unguarded expression she had seen on his face, a flicker of genuine surprise before the composure returned. "Something that belongs to you," he repeated. "In my father's papers." "Yes, and what would a cook possess that ended up in the private archive of the Duke of Ashvale?" She could feel the ground shifting beneath her. Every answer led to the next question, and every question led closer to the truth. She had two choices: silence, which would condemn her, or honesty, which might do the same, but at least would be honest. "I am not able to explain," she said. "Not tonight, not like this. But I swear to you on everything I hold sacred that I was not stealing. I have never taken anything from this house. I came to find what was already mine." He studied her for a long time. The lamp between them threw his shadow against the wall, vast and still. She could see his mind working behind those dark, watchful eyes, weighing her words against her circumstances, testing the shape of her claim against everything he knew and everything he did not. "My steward would say you are a thief," he said. "He would say you should be turned over to the magistrate tonight." "Your steward," she said, and the words came before she could stop them, pushed out by something deeper than caution, "has reasons of his own for wanting me gone." The silence that followed was absolute. She had said too much. She knew it the moment the words left her mouth, but she could not unsay them, and she found to her own surprise that she did not want to. He took a step closer. "What reasons?" She shook her head. "I cannot say more. Please, if you intend to dismiss me, dismiss me. But do not ask me to accuse a man to his master without proof. I have been accused without proof once in my life already. I will not do it to another, even to save myself." Something changed in his face. The investigative coldness softened, not into warmth but into something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. He held out his hand. "Give me the key." She placed it in his palm. His fingers closed around it, and for a moment, just a moment, his hand remained extended, as though he were about to say something that the rules of his world would not permit. Then he withdrew it. "Go to your room," he said. "You will speak of this to no one. I will not inform Mr. Price. I will not inform my mother. But you will answer my questions when I ask them, and I will ask them soon." He stepped aside, leaving her a path to the stairs. She moved past him, close enough to feel the warmth of the lamp, close enough to catch the faint scent of ink and wood smoke that clung to him. She did not look back. She climbed the stairs on legs that felt boneless, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat. She reached her room, closed the door, and sank onto the narrow bed. She had not been dismissed. She had not been accused. She had been given time. But the look in his eyes as she had spoken, that look of a man hearing something that rearranged the furniture of his assumptions, told her that time was not the same as safety. He would investigate. He would dig. And when he found what lay beneath the surface of her story, everything would change. The question was whether it would change in her favor, or whether the truth, like every truth she had tried to speak in the last 3 years, would be twisted beyond recognition by the people who had the most to lose from its telling. Price requested a meeting with the Duke the following morning. He arrived in the study at 9 o'clock precisely, his posture rigid, his face composed into an expression of grave concern. He carried a leather folder beneath his arm. "Ah, Your Grace," he began, closing the door behind him with the careful emphasis of a man about to deliver important news. "I must bring a matter of some urgency to your attention regarding the cook." The Duke was seated at his desk, but he did not look up from the letter he was reading. "Go on." "I have received reports from Mrs. Calloway, and from 2 members of the kitchen staff. that the woman has been leaving her quarters after hours. On at least 3 occasions in the past fortnight, she has been seen in parts of the house where she has no legitimate reason to be: the service corridors near the east wing, the passage to the wine cellars. He paused, letting the geography do its work. I believe she is stealing, Your Grace. Small items, perhaps, but the pattern is unmistakable. The Duke set down the letter. He looked at his steward for the first time. Which members of the kitchen staff? Mr. Price's composure held, but Nell would have noticed had she been there, a brief tightening around his eyes. I would prefer not to name them, Your Grace. They fear reprisal. She has, as you know, an unusual influence in the household. An unusual influence, the Duke repeated. You mean my daughter's attachment to her? Precisely. The staff are reluctant to speak against someone who appears to enjoy the favor of the family, but I assure you the reports are credible. The Duke leaned back in his chair. He was very still. The morning light from the window fell across his desk, illuminating the neat stacks of correspondence, the estate maps, the brass inkwell. It also illuminated his face, and what Mr. Fertialer Price saw there, or failed to see, should have warned him. You say she was seen near the East Wing cellars, the Duke said. Yes, Your Grace, near the storeroom where my father's papers are kept. That is correct. And your conclusion is that she is a thief. I can see no other explanation, Your Grace. I recommend immediate dismissal. The constable in the village can be sent for this afternoon. The Duke nodded slowly. Then he opened the drawer of his desk and took out an object. He placed it on the polished surface between them. It was the old key with the trefoil bow. Do you recognize this? He asked. Mr. Price looked at the key. For the first time his composure faltered. It was subtle, a slight widening of the eyes, a fractional stiffening of the shoulders. But to a man who was watching for it, as the Duke was now watching, it was as legible as a shout. I do not, Your Grace. It opens the storeroom, the one you mentioned. I found it last night in the passage outside the door. The lie came smoothly. The Duke had not found it. He had been given it, but Price did not know that. I went down to check. The room was undisturbed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. He let the silence work. You say the cook was seen in that corridor, but nothing was taken. And this key, which does not belong to the household set, was lying on the floor. Someone had it. Someone tried it and failed. Another lie. The key had worked. But the Duke wanted to see what Price would do with the information, how he would shape it, where his instincts would take him. Mr. Price recovered quickly. Then perhaps she was interrupted before she could complete the theft. All the more reason to act swiftly, Your Grace. Or perhaps, the Duke said, his voice dropping to the temperature of the cellar itself. Someone in this household has a reason to want her removed that has nothing to do with theft. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Mr. Price's face went blank, then careful, then blank again. I do not take your meaning, Your Grace. Then let me be clear. I was in the cellar last night. I was there before her, and I was there when she arrived. I spoke with her. She was not stealing. She was looking for something, and I intend to find out what it is. Until I do, she stays. She is not to be dismissed, disciplined, or interfered with by anyone. He picked up the key and placed it back in his drawer. Is that understood, Mr. Price? The steward's face was a mask, but behind it Nell would have recognized what was happening. The same mechanism that had operated in Aldous Price 3 years ago was operating now in his brother, the calculation, the recalibration, the rapid silent assessment of how much was known and how much could still be controlled. Perfectly, Your Grace, Mr. Price said. He left the study. His footsteps in the corridor were measured and even. The footsteps of a man who had not been rattled, who was not afraid, who was merely adjusting his strategy. The Duke listened to them fade. Then he sat very still for a long time, turning the trefoil key over in his fingers. He had not missed the look on Price's face when the key appeared. It was not the confusion of an innocent man seeing an unfamiliar object. It was the recognition of a man, who knew exactly what that key opened, and who had assumed until this moment that no one else did. The Dowager Duchess was not a woman given to sentiment. She had buried a husband, managed a great estate through years of agricultural depression, and raised a son who was now widely regarded as one of the most capable landowners in the north of England. She did not indulge in intuition. She dealt in observation and experience. But she was also a mother and a grandmother, and it was in this capacity that she summoned Nell to her sitting room on a cold Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after the Duke's confrontation with his steward. Nell arrived expecting reprimand. She found instead a fire burning high in the grate, a pot of tea on the side table, and the Dowager seated in a wingback chair with a shawl over her knees and an expression that was not hostile, but searching. "Sit down," the Dowager said. Nell hesitated. Servants did not sit in the presence of the family. "Your Grace, I should not. I did not ask for your opinion on etiquette. I asked you to sit." Nell sat. The chair was soft, far softer than anything she had rested in for 3 years. She perched on its edge, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The Dowager poured a second cup of tea and pushed it across the table. "Drink." "Your Grace, do not your Grace me. Every other breath, child. I am old and I am tired, and I have spent the morning watching my granddaughter refuse her breakfast for the 14th consecutive day. I am not in the mood for ceremony." Nell took the cup. The tea was hot and strong and faintly scented with bergamot. She drank and felt the warmth spread through her chest like a slow tide. "My son tells me you are not a thief," the Dowager said. He was rather forceful on the point. "He also tells me that Mr. Price wished to have you dismissed and that he refused. Do you know what this means? It means I am fortunate in His Grace's judgment. It means my son, who has not overruled a member of his staff in 10 years, has chosen to protect a junior cook against the recommendation of his most trusted steward. That is not fortune, that is significance." She set down her own cup. "Now, I am going to ask you a question, and I would like the truth, not the careful, diplomatic, eyes-on-the-floor version you give Mr. Price. The truth." Nell felt the blood leave her face. "What question, Your Grace?" "What is wrong with my granddaughter, and how do you know how to fix it?" The directness of it struck Nell like a physical blow. She had expected suspicion, accusation, interrogation. About the cellar, she had not expected this. A grandmother setting aside her pride and asking a cook to explain what no doctor or governess had been able to. "She is grieving," Nell said, and the simplicity of the words felt like releasing a breath she had been holding for months. "She has lost the person who made the world feel safe. And everyone around her is trying to fix her silence as though it is a problem, when it is the only language she has left for what she feels." The Dowager was very still. "And the food, the herbs, certain plants have properties that calm the body and quiet the mind. Lavender eases anxiety. Chamomile softens sleeplessness. Rosemary sharpens memory but also comforts. My father taught me this. He was a botanist. He spent his life studying the relationship between plants and human well-being." She stopped herself. She had said too much again. Her father. She had mentioned her father. The Dowager's eyes narrowed. "Your father was a botanist." "Yes, and yet you are a cook. Life does not always proceed in the direction one expects, Your Grace." The old woman looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes, gray and sharp, and so like Marin's that it made Nell's chest ache, moved across her face with the patient thoroughness of someone reading a difficult text. "Your hands," the Dowager said quietly. She reached across and turned Nell's right hand over. The palm was calloused and rough, scarred by burns from the range, cracked from lye soap. But the fingers were long and fine, the nails shaped with a care that spoke of a different life. "These are not the hands you were born with." Nell could not speak. The kindness of it, the simple act of being seen, of being touched by someone who was not demanding or accusing, but simply observing the truth with clear eyes, broke something open inside her. that she had kept sealed shut for 3 years. She pulled her hand back and pressed it against her apron. "I am a cook, Your Grace," she said, but her voice betrayed her. It wavered just once on the last word. The dowager did not press. She leaned back in her chair and picked up her tea. "Very well," she said. "You are a cook. But hear me, child. Whatever you are, whatever your story is, you have reached my granddaughter when no one else could. That is not a small thing. It is, in this house, perhaps the only thing that matters." She took a sip. "I was wrong to issue that order about the kitchen. I was wrong, and I am not a woman who says that often or easily. You may resume feeding her as you see fit." "I will speak to Miss Dundry." Nell stared at her. "Your Grace, do not thank me. It is not generosity, it is desperation. My granddaughter is disappearing, and you are the only person in this house who knows how to stop it. I would be a fool to stand in your way, and whatever else I am not a fool." She paused. "My son is not a fool either, though he does an excellent impression of one where matters of the heart are concerned. He sees you, child. I suspect he sees more than you would like." She waved her hand. "Go, feed my granddaughter, and when you are ready to tell someone the truth about who you are, come to me first. I promise you, whatever it is, I have heard worse." Nell stood. She curtsied. She left the room. She made it halfway down the corridor before the tears came, silent and scorching, streaming down her face as she walked with her head high and her back straight, because even in her breaking, she could not abandon the discipline that had kept her alive. Behind her, the dowager sat in her chair and stared at the fire. "Botanist's daughter," she murmured to herself. "In my kitchen, Caedmon Thorne. Is that you?" She picked up her teacup and held it to her lips without drinking. The name had surfaced from a memory 30 years old, a dinner party at Briarstone. The old Duke introducing a shy, clever man who knew more about plants than anyone in England, a man with a daughter he adored. She set the cup down and rang the bell for her maid. She had a letter to write. The Duke did not wait for answers to come to him. He went looking for them. On the night after his mother reversed her order about the kitchen, Emeric left his study and descended to the East Wing cellar alone. He carried the trefoil key in his pocket and a lamp in his hand. He unlocked the storeroom door and stepped inside. The room was as Nell had left it, dusty, undisturbed, the portfolios on their shelves, but now he looked at them with different eyes. He was not searching for evidence of theft. He was searching for the thing she had come to find. He began methodically pulling down each portfolio and examining its contents by lamplight. Estate papers, architectural plans, correspondence. His father's handwriting, familiar and still painful to see, filled page after page with the business of running a great house. He worked for an hour, setting aside each folder after examination, building a careful stack on the floor. Then he found the botanical notes, a sheaf of papers in a different hand, smaller and more precise than his father's, filled with Latin nomenclature and detailed drawings of plant specimens. The name at the top of the first page struck him like a bell. Dr. Caedmon Thorne, Briarstone Botanical Survey, 1839. Thorne, not a name he recognized from the household records. He read through the notes carefully. They were scholarly, meticulous, and clearly the work of a man who had spent considerable time at Briarstone. Cross-references mentioned the library, the glass house, the walled garden. This man had known the estate intimately. He set the botanical notes aside and continued searching. Behind the last portfolio on the shelf, pressed flat against the back panel, was a large sealed envelope. It was heavy. He pulled it free and turned it over. The seal was cracked, but unbroken. The wax stamped with an insignia he did not recognize. Written across the front in the same precise hand as the botanical notes were 2 lines, "For safekeeping with His Grace the Duke of Ashvale. To be delivered to my daughter, Sarah Margaret Thorne, in the event of my death." Emeric stared at the words. Sarah, his cook's name, was Nell, but Nell was not her real name. He had known that since the cellar. He had seen it in her face. in the way she carried herself, in the impossible scholarship of a woman who claimed to be an orphan from Cornwall, he broke the seal. Inside was a second copy of a last will and testament, naming Sarah Margaret Thorne as the sole beneficiary of the estate of Dr. Cabeman Thorne, Briar Cottage, Dartmoor, a trust fund administered through a solicitor in Exeter, a library of published works, a manuscript, everything. Beneath the will was a letter. "My dearest friend," it began, addressed to his father. "I write this in haste and in some distress. I have learned that my wife's cousin, Mr. Buzz, Aldous Price, has been making enquiries about my affairs in a manner that gives me great unease. I do not trust the man. I do not trust his intentions towards my daughter, should anything happen to me. I am therefore enclosing copies of my will, the deed to my property, and a letter of instruction for my solicitor. I beg you to keep these safe. If the worst should come, please see that Sarah receives what is hers. She is everything to me. Your devoted friend, Caedmon." The name Price. Aldous Price. Brother of Garrick Price, his own steward. Emmerich set the letter down on the dusty shelf. His hands were trembling. He was not a man who trembled. He had managed a 1,000-acre estate through drought and debt and death. He had buried his wife without public tears. He had held his silent daughter and whispered promises he could not keep without his voice breaking. But this quiet evidence of a theft so complete and so cruel that it had erased a woman's entire existence, this made his hands shake. She had been here for 6 months. She had scrubbed his pots and swept his floors and cooked for his daughter. And every day she had walked past the man whose brother had destroyed her life. She had eaten at the same servant's table, taken orders from the same voice, lived under the same roof. And she had done it in silence, without accusation, without vengeance, with nothing but a desperate disciplined patience that now struck him as the most extraordinary act of courage he had ever witnessed. He gathered the papers, the will, the letter, the botanical notes, and carried them upstairs to his study. He locked them in the drawer of his desk. Then he sat in the darkness for a very long time. He thought of her face in the lamplight of the cellar. "I was looking for something that belongs to me." He thought of her words about Mr. Price. "He has reasons of his own for wanting me gone." He thought of his daughter, silent and starving, who had come alive in the presence of this woman, because children, like dogs, know what the rest of the world is too proud or too blind to see. He thought of his father's failure. The old Duke had been entrusted with a dying man's last wish, and whether through forgetfulness or the chaos of his own final years, he had never fulfilled it. The papers had sat in that cellar untouched, while a young woman lost everything. That debt now fell to his son. Emmerich rose from his desk. It was past midnight, but he did not feel tired. He felt the opposite of tired. He felt the cold clarity of purpose, the same feeling he had known as a young man when he first understood the weight of his inheritance and what it demanded of him. He rang for a footman. In the morning he said, "I will require Mr. Four." Price and the cook called Nell to attend me in the study, separately. Mr. Price at 9. The cook at 10. The footman nodded and withdrew. Emmerich walked to the window. The night was black, the grounds invisible, the sky heavy with cloud. Somewhere in this house, on a narrow bed under the eaves, the woman who was not Nell was sleeping. Or, more likely, she was lying awake as he was, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He could not give her back 3 years. He could not undo the damage, but he could do what his father had promised and failed to do. He could give her back her name. The study was cold when Mr. Price entered the next morning. The fire had not been lit. The curtains were half drawn. The Duke sat behind his desk in shadow, the sealed envelope and the will laid out before him. He did not rise. He did not greet his steward. "Sit down, Mr. Price," he said. Garrick Price sat. His posture was perfect. His face showed nothing but professional attentiveness. He was a man who had spent 15 years controlling the interior of this house, and he controlled himself with the same precision. "Do you have a brother named Aldous?" the Duke asked. The question landed without warning. There was no preamble, no pleasantry, no easing into the subject. The Duke's voice was toneless, clinical, the voice of a man conducting an examination. Price blinked once. "I do, Your Grace. He lives in Devon." "And what is his profession?" "He is a man of private means, Your Grace. He came into some property several years ago." "Property?" the Duke repeated. "A cottage on Dartmoor by any chance? Belonging to a scholar named Thorne?" The blood drained from Garrick Price's face so quickly and so completely that, for a moment, he looked like a man carved from chalk. His lips parted. No sound came out. His eyes dropped to the papers on the desk and he recognized them. Nell would have seen it. The same recognition she had seen in 100 small moments over 6 months, the flicker of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and wishes he did not. "Your Grace, I can explain." "I am sure you can," the Duke said. "But I am not interested in your explanation. I am interested in hers." He reached across the desk and rang the bell. The door opened, and Nell walked in. She had not been told why she was summoned. She entered the study with her hands clasped in front of her apron clean, her expression composed. She saw Mr. Price first sitting in the chair before the desk, his face ashen. Then she saw the papers, her father's handwriting, the sealed envelope, the will. She stopped. Her breath left her body in a single sharp exhale, as though she had been struck. "Come in," the Duke said. His voice was different now. The clinical tone was gone, replaced by something warmer and more careful. "Close the door." She obeyed. She walked to the desk. She could not take her eyes from the papers. 3 years. 3 years of silence and servitude and hopeless searching. And there they were, spread on the polished mahogany, real and tangible and irrefutable. The Duke stood. He came around the desk and stood beside her, not between her and Price, but next to her, a positioning that was deliberate and unmistakable. He was not standing as her judge. He was standing as her witness. "Mr. Gudge." "Price," he said, turning to the steward. "The woman you know as Nell is Miss Saren Thorne. She is the daughter of Dr. Caedmon Thorne, a scholar and a friend of my father. 3 years ago, your brother, Aldous Price, produced a forged will and stole Miss Thorne's home, her inheritance, and her father's life work. He left her with nothing. She came to this house, under a false name, and at great personal risk to find the proof that would restore what was taken from her. He picked up the will from the desk. This is that proof. A second copy of her father's true will entrusted to my father for safekeeping, along with the deed to her property, and a letter that names your brother as the man Caedmon Thorne feared most. He held the will so that Price could see it clearly. Did you know? The silence that followed was the longest of Nell's life. She watched Garrick Price's face, the face she had studied for 6 months across the kitchen, across corridors, across the invisible gulf between a servant and her overseer. She watched the composure collapse, not all at once, in stages. The jaw first, a tremor in the muscle. Then the hands, gripping the arms of the chair until the knuckles went white. Then the eyes, which dropped to the floor and stayed there. "I knew," he said. His voice was barely audible. "Not everything, not at first, but I knew. Aldous told me the girl had no claim. He said the father had left debts. He said the will was legitimate. I believed him because it was easier to believe him." He swallowed. "When she arrived here, I did not recognize her at first, but after a few weeks I began to suspect. She looked like him, like Dr. Thorne. The same eyes, the same way of handling plants, of looking at a leaf as though it were a page to be read." He raised his head. "I should have spoken. I should have come to you. I did not. I tried to have her removed instead. That is the truth, and I will not dress it in excuses." The study was silent. The mantel clock ticked. Outside, a blackbird sang its two-note song in the bare branches of the elm. The Duke looked at Saren. "Miss Thorne, these papers are yours. They were always yours. My father was asked to protect them, and he failed. I failed. By trusting the wrong man, and by not seeing what was in front of me." He paused. His voice, which had been steady throughout, wavered for the first time. "This house owes you a debt that I do not know how to repay." Saren reached out and touched the will. Her father's handwriting swam before her eyes. She traced the letters of her own name with a fingertip. Saren Margaret Thorne. She had not seen it written by his hand in 3 years. The tears came without permission, sliding down her cheeks and falling onto the polished desk. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall. "I did not come here for repayment," she said. Her voice was thick but clear. "I came for the truth. You have given it to me." She turned to Garrick Price. The man who had tormented her for 6 months, who had issued orders designed to isolate and break her, who had tried to have her dismissed and arrested, sat in his chair like a ruin. She looked at him and felt the full weight of her anger, vast and justified and 3 years in the making. She could destroy him with a word. The Duke would do whatever she asked. She thought of her father. She thought of the way he had spoken about the plants in his garden. Every living thing deserves the chance to grow. Saren, even the weeds, even the ones that try to choke you, you pull them out, but you do not poison the soil. "I do not want his destruction," she said quietly. "I want my home. I want my father's work. I want my name." The Duke nodded. He turned to Price. "You will leave Briarstone today. A letter will be sent to your brother, informing him that the matter is now in the hands of my solicitors. The forged will and the stolen property will be contested in court. You may consider your position here terminated." He paused, and what he said next carried the echo of Saren's own restraint. "But you will not be handed to the magistrate. Not today. You will be given a reference sufficient to find work elsewhere far from this county. What your brother faces is his own affair. You chose silence over honesty, Mr. Price. That is a grave failing. But Miss Thorne has shown you a mercy you did not show her, and I will honor it." Garrick Price rose from his chair. He was an old man suddenly, aged by 10 years in 10 minutes. He looked at Saren. His mouth opened as though to speak, but no words came. He bowed, a stiff, broken movement, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. Without turning, he said, "She is right. You should listen to her. About the child. About everything." Then he was gone. The door closed. The study was quiet. Saren stood before the desk, her father's papers in her hands, tears drying on her face, and felt the ground beneath her shift, not the sickening lurch of loss she had felt 3 years ago, but something else. A settling, a coming to rest, the end of a long and terrible journey. The Duke stood on the other side of the desk watching her. He made no move to touch her. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply stood, his dark eyes full of something that had no name yet, something that was still becoming itself. "You called me Miss Thorne," she said. "It is your name. No one has called me that in 3 years. Then, it is long overdue." She looked at him, this severe, quiet, grieving man who had lied for her, searched for her truth, and stood beside her while it was spoken aloud. She saw what his mother had seen, what his daughter had perhaps always known, that beneath the granite, beneath the duty and the silence, there was a heart that understood justice, not as a principle, but as an act. Something you did for another person, not because it was easy, but because it was owed. "Thank you," she said, "for finding them, for believing me." "I did not believe you," he said. "Not at first. I suspected you. I watched you. I followed you into a cellar in the middle of the night." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, so faint she might have imagined it. Belief came later. It came when my daughter ate bread from your hand. It came when you knelt in the dirt and taught her the name of a plant. I did not trust your words. I trusted hers, or rather her silence, which said more than anyone else's words. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden, the same garden where Marin had knelt in the soil and touched the sage. Stay, he said. The word was simple. It was also, she understood, the hardest word he had spoken in a very long time. Not as my cook, not as a servant. Stay as yourself, as Saren Thorne, as a guest of this house, until your affairs are settled and your home is restored. She should have refused. It was improper. It would set tongues wagging from the kitchen to the village, but she thought of Marin, of the child who still had not spoken, who still came to the kitchen each afternoon and sat on the stone step and ate what Saren prepared with the quiet trust of a creature who has found, the one person in the world who understands its pain. She could not leave that child. Not yet, perhaps not ever. I will stay, she said. But I have a condition. He raised an eyebrow. A condition. I will continue to cook, not as a servant, but because it is who I am. My father gave me his knowledge of plants, and my life gave me the skill to use it. Your daughter needs both. I will not sit in a guest room and take tea while she goes hungry. The almost smile returned. It was stronger this time, warm enough to reach his eyes. You are a stubborn woman, Miss Thorne. I am my father's daughter, Your Grace. He inclined his head. Then, we have an agreement. 6 months passed. Spring came late to the moors that year, but when it arrived with a vengeance. The hills around Briarstone turned from brown to blazing green, almost overnight. The kitchen garden burst into life, a riot of color and scent that spilled over the old stone walls and tumbled down the terraces towards the lake. Saren stood in the middle of it, her hands in the soil, her face tilted up to the pale April sun. She was not wearing a cook's apron or a maid's gray dress. She wore a simple gown of deep blue linen, practical and well cut, chosen by the dowager with the brisk authority of a woman who would not tolerate argument on matters of wardrobe. Her hair was loose, held back by a single ribbon. Her hands were still calloused, still marked by years of work. But the burns had faded and the cracks had healed. She was planting rosemary. The kitchen garden had become her project. Or rather, it had become her father's project, continued. She was transforming it from a simple herb patch into a medicinal garden worthy of Caedmon Thorne's legacy, a living catalogue of the plants he had studied and the knowledge he had gathered over a lifetime. Each bed was labeled with its Latin name and its properties, and a journal, written in her own hand in the same precise script as her father's, recorded every planting, every harvest, every observation. It was her father's unfinished manuscript, begun again. The solicitors had done their work. Briar Cottage had been recovered. The forged will had been overturned by the county court. Aldous Price had fled to the continent rather than face prosecution, leaving behind a trail of debts and a reputation that would follow him wherever he went. The trust fund, diminished but not destroyed, had been restored. Saren was on paper a woman of independent means once more. But she had not left Briarstone. She had not gone home to Dartmoor. Home, she had discovered, was not a place you returned to. It was a place you built, sometimes, in the most unexpected soil. A sound reached her from the house. She straightened and turned. The kitchen door was open, and standing in the doorway, her white pinafore smudged with flour, was Marin. The child was holding a small loaf of bread. She had made it herself, under Saren's instruction, kneading the dough with her small, determined hands, adding the rosemary sprig with the solemn concentration of a surgeon. It was lopsided, slightly too brown on one side, and entirely perfect. Marin walked down the garden path. She stopped in front of Saren and held out the bread. And then she spoke. It was a single word. Quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. Here. Saren dropped to her knees. She took the bread. She looked into the child's gray eyes and saw the shuttered blankness that had lived there for more than a year was gone. In its place was something fragile and new and alive, a light returning to a room that had been dark for a very long time. "Thank you," Saren whispered. She pulled the child into her arms and held her. Marin's thin body stiffened for a moment, then softened, then settled against her with the full, trusting weight of a child who has decided, finally, to come back to the world. Behind them, a footstep on the gravel. Saren looked up. Emeric was standing at the edge of the garden, his coat over his arm, his dark hair disordered by the spring wind. He had been watching. She did not know for how long. His face was very still, but his eyes were not. His eyes were full. He walked towards them. He did not rush. He moved with the same deliberate patience that had defined every step of his slow, careful, relentless journey towards the truth. He stopped beside them and looked down at his daughter, pressed against Saren's chest, her small hand gripping the fabric of Saren's dress. "She spoke," Saren said. Her voice was barely steady. "I heard." He knelt. He knelt in the dirt of the garden, in his good trousers, beside the rosemary beds, and he placed his hand on his daughter's back. Marin turned her head and looked at him. Then she reached out one flour-dusted hand and touched his face. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him in 11 months. His jaw tightened. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low and not entirely under control, "about what this garden needs." "And what is that?" Saren asked. "A permanent gardener. Someone who understands plants the way your father did. Someone who can teach my daughter to grow things. Someone who will stay." "I am staying," Saren said. "We agreed. We agreed you would stay as a guest. I am amending the terms." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady, the almost smile gone, replaced by something open and undefended and entirely new. "I am asking you to stay as my wife." The garden was quiet. The wind moved through the herbs, carrying the scent of rosemary and sage and new earth. Marin looked between the two adults, her gray eyes watchful and waiting. Saren thought of the locked kitchen door. She thought of the cellar in the dark, the key in her palm, the sound of his footsteps coming towards her. She thought of the morning he had spoken her name, the real one, the one her father had given her, and how it had felt like being handed back a piece of herself she had thought was gone forever. She thought of her father's words. "Every living thing deserves the chance to grow." "Yes," she said, "but I have a condition." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a quiet sound, rusty with disuse, but real, and it changed his face entirely. "Of course you do. I keep the kitchen garden. It is mine. No head gardener, no estate manager, no well-meaning duchess is to interfere with it. It is my father's work, and it will remain my father's work." "Agreed," he said. "And I continue to cook for Marin every day. Whatever she needs." "Agreed." "And you," she said, her voice softening, "will learn the names of every plant in this garden, all of them in Latin." He looked at the sprawling, chaotic, magnificent garden that surrounded them, the dozens of beds, the hundreds of specimens, the lifetime of botanical knowledge planted in the cold northern soil. "That," he said, "may take some time." "We have time," Saren said. And she smiled, the first full, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in 3 years, and it was like the spring arriving at Briarstone, late and sudden, and worth every moment of the long winter that had come before. Marin, still pressed between them, looked up at the sky. She opened her mouth. The second word came easier than the first, pushed out on a breath of warm spring air, quiet but certain. "Stay." Saren pulled her closer. Emeric placed his hand over hers. The three of them knelt together in the dirt of the garden, surrounded by the things that grow when you give them patience and light and time, and the silence of Briarstone Hall was finally, irrevocably filled.